All right, so let's try this again. Now I have audio. Um, Second time is the charm for actually going live. Um, all right, so I'm Franklin. Thanks for watching. If you're tuning in and watching this, hope you find it informative. First and foremost, I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. So everything here is for legal education, general education, entertainment. If this is entertaining to you, I believe it is. So I'm assuming it will be entertaining for you. It's all legal education. It's entertainment. None of it is legal advice. If you need specifically legal advice, contact an attorney of your own. And I am not your attorney. Nobody in the comments is your attorney. You should be getting legal advice from a licensed professional in your area. So yeah. Anyways, this live stream, we are going to focus on talking a little bit about podcast guest release agreements, guest release waivers. There's a lot of different names for them. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then I'll dive into trying to draft from scratch an example of a template. And if it turns out well, I'll release it and make it live, available for download. If you're watching this later, it'll be available in the description down below or the chat, comments, wherever. I'll find a way to distribute it. But anyways, the focus of this is a podcast guest release agreement. So what does that even mean and why do you need one? Well, there's a lot of reasons you need one. But one of the main reasons you need one is whenever someone comes onto your production as a podcaster, you need to, or really even a YouTuber. So if I had another guest on here, I probably would likely need to do the same thing. But having someone on your production, you need to get certain permissions and waivers from them to exploit that recording, either whether it's live or later on, as just the general kind of the baseline standard here is from a privacy standpoint. So you might be thinking, what privacy? What does that have to do with anything? Well, right of publicity is a right of privacy at the state law level here, at least in the U.S. And so for that reason, you need to understand that right of publicity is something that only one person, individual, can grant you. They might, and the way that they do that is through an agreement. You get a waiver. You get them to expressly consent to you utilizing their name, their image, and their likeness, their private attributes as a person. So that's the main reason why you focus on getting that, because if you don't have that, then they could come back and say that, you need to take on the podcast episode, whether it's audio or video and audio or some other type of production. And that would not be good because you either, especially if you have more than one guest, you would then have to either edit and like cut that person out if you even could do that, or it would just be a headache because then you'd be having to take down past episodes or past productions left and right. If someone was unhappy with it, their mind changed or whatever. So that's really one of the main reasons is you need this right and this consent from anyone to be able to exploit their right of publicity, their name, their image, or their likeness. And then in most jurisdictions now, that also includes their voice, which is going to be important for a podcast audio. It's not just video. It's not just their image or their likeness that you're exploiting. Excuse me. So that's important to think about. And then I have my Star Wars glass with some Boda box in it. But either way, I will be drinking a little bit, sipping on that and water and whatever. But anyways, so if you're watching live, if you're watching this later, I hope you understand now kind of why you need a consent from someone and a release of the ability to exploit their name, their image, and their likeness. So yeah, not only could they force you to take something down later, or they might change their mind or whatever. It's just good practice because if you're allowing others to distribute your podcast, if you want to future-proof your production, somebody is going to, whether it's an investor or whether it is someone that you're licensing or selling the episodes to or the content to, they're going to expect that you have waivers and consents that address the right of publicity, this name, image, likeness concept for every episode. If you don't, then you'll probably have to go back and get it after the fact, which is always more difficult at that point to get people to be on board with it. So anyways, that's the privacy side of it. The other side of it is you want you want like a waiver, and you want to be able to have a right to claim that you own the entire episode. So somebody that is on your show might be able to they might be contributing great ideas or content and be a co-creator with you of that particular episode. And so you want to make sure that they're giving up those rights too. And they're contributing that to the production so that you can own it as your podcast production and retain ownership to that. If you don't, then they could claim partial ownership of either aspects of the podcast or the podcast as a whole. Just kind of depends on the facts and circumstances surrounding each production. But that's part of the main reason is if you're looking at that, you want to make sure that you can claim ownership and retain ownership of the entire episode, the entire production that you have. Anyways, so what does it look like? You need to have a release agreement. You need to have some type of contract in place that identifies what you're looking for. It's the fact that I got it working. Okay, so going back to what we were talking about. Drafting a contract to cover podcast guest. Well, it's pretty simple. To start, you need to know the guest name. You want their contact information. Let's just say email would probably be ideal. And so that way you can at least start with, if you do reference back to this, for whatever reason you're sending it, someone else is referencing back to it, having some type of email contact, a way to get in touch with them is going to be key. So let's just call this a podcast guest release agreement. And we'll use the fun Google formatting. And all right, so you want another name, first and last name. There is a chance that they might have an actual like entity. So if your guest is some really famous person or whatever, they might have a company that they are signing for on their behalf or connected to. That could be the case if they don't sign contracts personally. Maybe they have some type of agreement with their loan out company, their LLC that they operate under, whatever. So the guest first and last name could also be a corporate entity. That probably would not be uncommon depending on the size and scope of your podcast production and the types of guests that you're going to be landing. But anyways, so yeah, the name of an agreement, just at the top of every contract, you'll have like the preamble. So you'll have the title of the agreement, and this is a podcast guest release agreement. You can even title it the name of your podcast. So if you wanted to have that, you could even add your own podcast brand. If you have like a logo that you use or something like that, you could add it in here. But you have the first and last name for your guest, and then you want a way to contact them. So you would have their email address. And so that would be what is at the top. And then you have your actual body of the contract, which we'll come back to in just a minute. And then you have the signature block. So you'll have the actual place in which your guests sign, and then you'll also have a place for yourself, your production company. And so that would be part of what you want from a structure standpoint for the podcast guest release. So what that would look like though is you would have your guest signature, and then that would be your guest signature, and then you can have a signature block for yourself. So that would be the podcast, whether it is you as a host or production company, however you operate. Depends on the size and scope of your organization. And then you would have the date that people sign. You can just even copy and paste that. We'll clean it up later, but that's what the signature block would look like. You can get more detailed than that. If the guest signature is going to be first and last name up there, then you'd be fine. You wouldn't really need to put their name here. But if for some reason this is like an entity name, and I'll add a comment here. And if this is an entity name, then you would want to include the written name of the person signing on behalf of the entity. That's what that would look like. And then for your own production company, if that is, it'd be probably the same thing, your production company name, and then the name of the person signing, because we all can't read hand signatures. So if it's not put anywhere else, that's where you would want to try and put it, is down there. So that's typically what you need in the signature block. So you have the lines for people to sign. The other thing is you would typically do by, if it is you're signing on behalf of a company. It just kind of depends on how you structure and how your particular production is set up, and whether you have a production company or not, and whether your guest is signing for their production company or not. All right. So where does that leave us now? So you have first and last name, email. You can even include a mailing address if you want to get that granular. You can include a phone number. You can optional information here would be contact info. And it really is your preference as to how detailed and how in-depth you want to get with the information you're collecting from podcast guests, if you're not going to be collecting this somewhere else. But again, like I mentioned earlier, some contract drafting mindsets for record keeping purposes are you want everything stored in this one document, so that if this is all that you have left to contact someone, you have multiple means of finding that quickly. It's not stored in some CRM somewhere or some email, your Gmail or some other database that you're using to contact people and trying to get all that. So it's completely up to you as to whether or not you include more information, and that's, again, whether your guests will actually disclose it either. So yeah, that could be, like I said, mailing address or phone number, phone numbers, etc. Whatever else somebody else might have for contact. All right, so this is the podcast guest release agreement. You don't have to say agreement. You can just say podcast guest release. It's kind of up to you. I'll leave agreement up there just to, that's my preference. All right, so let's flesh out the body of this and kind of talk through. I would, like I mentioned in the beginning, you want to start with probably just a statement of consent to the recording, and then you'll have a the actual grant of rights. And so, like I mentioned, that would be the name, image, likeness, and you want to actually detail out the person's name, their image, their likeness, and then also voice. And then after grant of rights, then you'll also include a grant of the content. So you want to get their performance, basically, is kind of what you're thinking about. You want to think about if they are coming on your podcast and they are sharing information, the whole presentation of what they do. And so that's part of what you want to cover. And you want to make sure that that is owned by you as an individual or your podcast production. So that'll be part of it. We can also work that into the grant of rights, and then also include their performance that's going to be captured in the recording that you're doing. And then the other kind of fun stuff that you want to include, the boilerplate legal stuff, is an originality statement, originality. Sorry, I can't see what I'm typing. Originality and basically a representation and a warranty that their performance is original, that the information, their presentation, everything they're doing is original. And that's going to really cover you if for whatever reason they're sharing information or their content is infringing on someone else's that's in existence somewhere else. So worst case scenario, let's just say, hopefully you wouldn't republish this, maybe this would be happening live, but if someone started reading Harry Potter on your podcast and you were live streaming or you left it into the edit for some reason, that would be copyright infringement. If they if they started reading Harry Potter for whatever reason from the book, then that would not be original content. You would have to have a license to redistribute that. And most likely you do not have a license from the publishers, the rights holders of Harry Potter, any of the books, to have that reproduced. So that's really kind of what you're getting at. That's a very extreme example. But if someone comes onto your podcast and they start sharing, maybe it's corporate secrets, it's stuff that they shouldn't, they're under confidentiality obligations to share. That's really where you don't want to get into trouble yourself. And so really that's where the rep and warranty for originality comes into play. There are other aspects here that you could include that kind of go a step further and say that they indemnify. And so indemnity would be if they do include something, if they do for whatever reason share something that is infringing or produce their performance is something that is infringing on somebody else's, and you are stuck dealing with it. Indemnification would come in and say, nope, they have to help defend you against that other person that's saying it is infringing. So again, if they were reading Harry Potter, you published it, they would then indemnify you. If you had that in your contract, it would say, well, I'm getting sued or I'm getting a cease and desist letter from this other company. You need to step in and handle this, and I'm not going to be out of pocket. And so that's really where indemnification comes in. And the language we're looking for is defend. It's indemnify, defend, and hold harmless. So that's kind of going to be helpful in that sense. But again, I would categorize this as potentially optional depending on the scope and how intense or how long you want a podcast release to be. For the most part, if you get a rep and warranty, then they'll be in breach of contract and you can deal with it that way. Indemnification is kind of fast tracking it. It's easier to have that in the contract, but if you want to have a more simplified, and again, this is going to depend on your jurisdictions and local court rules and all that kind of stuff. But it is one potential thing that you can have as optional. And then coupled with that would be a limitation of liability clause, which I'm not going to get into for the sake of this because it's a little over the top for the purposes of this particular type of agreement. But there is if you wanted to go hardcore, you could throw in a limitation of liability that says you as an individual production company have no liability in connection with their performance and your use of their performance and exploitation of it. And then in reverse, on their end, they would then be fully liable to you as how you would draft it. They would be fully liable to you for any damages that you incur through their performance and your distribution of their performance. So again, completely optional. I would not go as far as to have a limitation liability clause, really even indemnification, because that's the whole point. It's like the type of podcasts that I typically work on are not ones that rise to that level. It's more of just someone sharing their information, sharing their personal story, sharing their own experiences and expertise in a particular area and on a particular topic, not something that would rise to the level of necessarily needing full indemnification language and limitation of liability and all that kind of stuff. But if you are in a podcasting space where there is a high level of sensitivity around the content you're talking about, maybe from a libel standpoint, if you're having a guest on that is going to be sharing information about someone else that is sensitive or has a high degree of just risk involved, let's say you have a whistleblower that's coming on your podcast or something like that. Like that's the kind of thing where you want to then like kind of think more critically about those types of clauses and whether or not you need them and should include them. And again, definitely work with an attorney to kind of run through some of that. Okay. So that kind of lays out the gist of kind of what we're going to look for in a podcast guest release agreement. But yeah, kind of consent to this is a consent to the recording and distribution. All right. So I have Gemini open. So Google Gemini is going to be a fun one to use here. I figured why not try to just kind of see what it thinks. So I ran through what I would think could be in a podcast release form. So the way that I typically prompt with Gemini is to give it a specific role to play. So I don't know how familiar you are with prompting or not, but really this is kind of where I start is thinking through, okay, what persona do I need Gemini to take on here? And I have switched over to Gemini. I was on ChatGPT 4 paid for a little while, but I'm using Gemini Advanced just to try something else out and see what sticks. But anyways, I'll tell it that you are a expert entertainment lawyer, highly skilled in drafting contracts. Let's start with just like a checklist. Maybe just a checklist of key contract considerations for a podcast guest release agreement. And so what I'll say is generate a checklist. Generate's not the right word. Let's just say draft a checklist of key contract considerations for a podcast guest release agreement. Let's just see what it says. All right. Okay, so this will be fun to check against what I just went through. All right, so identification of the parties. So clearly state the legal names of the podcaster and their company if applicable. So hey, nailed that one. And the guest. Include contact information. Email addresses are usually sufficient for both parties. Cool. We did that one. And I even noted it can be an entity name. So the element up here is really kind of, I'll start going through and making this a little bit more formatted. This is typically how I like to do. Let's do it like this. Whoa, did not mean to do that. Okay. All right, we can combine these together, merge cells. We'll have a section focused on the podcast guest first. So we'll do first and last name, and then we will do email. And the reason I do it this way is because it helps me. I prefer to not just say every time guest first and last name, guest email, kind of like we did down here. It's a little more streamlined. First and last name, and we can even put their /entity name, and we can just make this a little more friendly, a little more less legalistic, and just say business name instead of entity name. Email address. All right, and then we'll leave the rest of that there. So this is one way that it can look, and then this way, if you're using Adobe Sign or some other platform to get signatures, DocuSign, Adobe Sign, whatever, you can drag and drop the fields onto here for people to complete. Either way, formatting is completely up to the person that is going to be using this template. But yeah. Okay, so back to Gemini, our expert attorney here, expert entertainment lawyer that is highly skilled in drafting contracts. All right, so we got all of this covered, I would think, for this first part. Grant of rights. All right, let's see. Specify what rights the guest is granting. So voice and likeness. That is perfect. That's exactly what we were talking about here. And let me see. That is very jarring to go back and forth between really bright screen and really dark screen. What I will do, I don't know how to make this dark mode unless I'm just missing it. So what I'll do is I'll turn Gemini into bright mode. So there we go. Now it will stop going dark and bright very quickly. That's weird. I didn't know how to do it over there. Anyways, okay. So right to record the guest's voice and likeness. Does it even mention name? Again, gotta love Gemini. Gotta love the large language models coming in and potentially missing stuff. But okay, the right to record a guest's voice and likeness. Yeah, that would definitely need to include explicitly list name, image, likeness, and voice. The key is to explicitly name all of them. And then grab that performance. So the right to edit, reproduce, and publicly perform the recording. That is correct. Consent to the recording and distribution. Some of the other things that actually just made me think of, I want to incorporate our grant of rights, consent to the recording and distribution, but we also want to make sure that we add in typically it's called like a right of first, a right of maybe first refusal. Is that what I'm thinking of? Either way, it's the right to edit and review the content before it goes live. And so the approval rights, that's the other thing. So that can be something, let me just write that, approval rights. Approval rights is something that as the podcast producer, you and distributor, you don't really want to give that because that kind of takes away your creativity and your ability to move quickly too, if you're having to wait for approval rights of the person that you've had on as a guest. So therefore, I'm drafting this from the mindset of you are the podcast production company, podcast producer. So in that sense, the approval rights would be a backup clause. It would be an optional clause, and therefore, if it's just something you have on hand, if you have a guest that asks for it, or a guest that provides their own clause, and so that's kind of, again, it's something you can give if you want to be nice, but most of the time, it just depends on whether or not the guests that you have on will ask for it. Okay, so the other items here that we also want to address up in the top is, and I'll insert a table element here, podcast name. So you want to put in the podcast name, episode number, ideally if you know it, or really you could just do episode number, or you could also do recording date. So hopefully when you're filling this out, you have a recording date scheduled, and that could also be recording, or it could also, you could actually have like the episode if you know the episode number that they'll be on. It's difficult because oftentimes you don't know like the episode number, you don't really probably know the title of the episode unless you're pre-planning like a season in advance and you're blocking out a whole season talking about different topics. But if you're just doing like a every kind of like every week type podcast where you have like guests of the week come on, that's kind of really where you would have a difficult time filling this particular piece out. And I see Brian's watching. Hey, Brian, good to see you. And yeah, thank you. I am trying to bring the YouTube channel back to life. This is more of just a test run to kind of see how the live streaming goes. Whoops, didn't mean to move the screen. Okay, so this is all stuff that you can put at the top if you have this however much information you have at the time. Again, a lot of this could probably be automated if you're using some type of like automation flow in your podcast booking. And so that would really help kind of speed up some of this and make it a little more hands off in your approach, depending on how you're doing this. Okay, so approval rights we talked about. Let's go back and see what Gemini says. Right to edit, reproduce, distribute, and publicly perform the recording. Yes, that's what I was getting at here. So we'll just start pulling this in to make it a little bit more. And then you specify the media formats. I don't really know why that would be necessary. You would just say, this is what I would say. In any media, whether now known or later invented. Yeah, I think that would cover you. And there's actually a really interesting case about not just saying in any media, because courts have interpreted that to mean if you stop there and you don't include the whether now known or hereinafter later invented, some courts have said any media means at the time that the contract was entered into. That was what the parties knew of. So think about like when VHS tapes were around, or before that, even like when you had like another example I think is in the music industry. Before that, you had like if you had like a vinyl recording, then you had Betamax, or you had 8-track tapes, and then you had cassette tapes, and then you had CDs, and then you had streaming. It kind of begs the question of how broadly defined and how broadly applicable is that definition of media, and you don't want to be stuck at the time in which the contract was drafted, which some courts and some judges have said was the intent of the parties, that if there's a new media that comes later on, you got to go back and get consents. So really important phrasing to include if you are saying any media, whether now known or later invented, is important. So yes, and if you want to get specific, again, this would be something that would be friendly if you're the podcast guest and you're like really wanting to narrow and be specific with your the way that you enter into agreements and you agree to be a guest on somebody's podcast, is you want to specify, okay, this is going to be this particular podcast, this one episode. You can't re-edit the footage, use the footage somewhere else, or post it on certain social media platforms. You could get granular in that way if you wanted to, and that would be where you could specify the media formats. But again, I'm drafting this from a mindset of being more of a podcast producer and what's most friendly to them, which is having non-specific restrictions, not having specific restrictions like that. Consider whether the rights are exclusive or non-exclusive to the podcaster. So typically this would be non-exclusive because the content you're talking about is not going to be exclusive to that one podcast episode. Again, this kind of gets into the heart of what your podcast is all about. If somebody's coming to you with an exclusive story and you're going to break something, then that's kind of where you would think about it. But yeah, it would be non-exclusive rights over all of that. And so the performance. Okay. And yeah, so there could be limitations. Again, that's the Gemini's coming in here and giving us something that is very specific to the podcast guest, something that they might ask for. All right. Ownership of content. Clearly state who owns the copyright in the final podcast episode. Again, typically the podcast owner, podcaster, and that's what we've said. And then let's see. Address whether the guest retains any rights in their specific contributions. That again, some of this stuff is really more so if you have a very specific guest you're bringing on that's going to be talking about something that is they own, and let's say they're sharing something specific that is about their business model or something like that, and they want to retain ownership of it, then they might want that type of language. But again, I would say not really within the scope of most podcast episodes and podcast productions. Consider including a work made for hire clause if the podcast is produced as a part of the guest's employment. Not really applicable for most people. Compensation. Oh, they put if applicable. Perfect. I guess some people could be getting paid. So if the guest is being paid, if the guest is not being paid, include a clear statement to that effect. I don't really think that's necessary. I think you could have something up here at the top for the good and valid not void. Good and valid consideration of both parties. For both good, yeah, okay, something along those lines. We can even just use Gemini to. I've been getting error messages from it recently, so let's see if it works. Let's see what it says. Oh, yeah, here we go. We will just use, well, it's going, shoot, it's going all in on it. What is it trying to show me? Oh, it's actually, so it's actually laying out what consideration of both parties could be is for the production company. Oh, it's literally taken some of the other stuff, the amount of the fee, whether a copy of the final edited recording. Oh, this is not necessary. This right here is sufficient for the good and valuable consideration of both parties. The parties agree to enter into this contract and be bound by its terms and conditions. Let's see if I shorten it and see if it comes out with something better. Okay, well that's terrible. That's way too short. You're missing some stuff there. Okay, let's just insert this and I'll end up deleting all of this. Not necessary. Okay. All right, so really consideration is necessary for the contract, for any contract to be valid and binding on both parties. But in this case, the argument would be that if somebody's coming onto your podcast, it's great for their brand, it's great for them, they're contributing, and in return, they're reaching your audience. Those would be some of the arguments of what value is being provided to them outside of just a financial remuneration, financial payment. And then in terms of the podcast production company, they get the value of being able to have a nice podcast episode that they can produce. All right, so that's compensation. So if the guest is being paid, yeah, you definitely want to state that. So this is for sure something you want to include if you are for some reason paying a guest to be a part of your podcast. Again, if they're not being paid, I don't think you need to expressly state that. Any potential bonuses or royalty payments based on podcast performance. Yeah, I mean, maybe in more complex podcast productions, but in this case, most likely not going to be a part of what's necessary right now. Another thing here is sometimes it is possible to think about maybe someone's going to be a guest on your podcast and they're paying you for access to your platform, to your audience. That's where you would kind of flip this on its head, and the compensation would be if the guest is paying you as opposed to your production company, as opposed to you paying them. So I'm sure Gemini could probably draft some stuff there for us, but representations and warranties, like we talked about. All right, so yeah, they have the right to grant the specified rights. Their contributions are original, so we got that covered. Grant of rights. Originality, they represent and warrant that. And then guarantee, we could probably just have Gemini do this. Draft a representations and warranties clause. And it seems to be picking up on the context of it being, geez, no, it did not. It's pulling in some random Delaware. Yeah, no, this is not what I want. Let me try to modify the prompt. Podcast, what do we call this? Podcast guest release. Draft a representations and warranties clause. And we want it to be, well, let's just see what it comes back with that. All right, so let's just start with, let's see if it can do formal. I'm trying to get it to not do it in bullet points. see if that works. Making it into full sentences and no bullet points. There we go. And I could have done that, just inserted it and done it myself, but hey, why not? We'll just start with that. Podcast, we think we're just saying guest. Hereby represents, I don't know, you don't need the hereby. The guest represent warrants to the production company. We'll use that. They possess the full right and authority. We can go ahead and add that up here. Podcast guest, podcast name. We'll just do podcast production company. And that could be your individual self, or it could be whatever else. We'll see where it goes from there. All right, so guest represents and warrants. I don't even need to say the. Guest represents and warrants to the production company that they possess the full right, authority, and power to enter this agreement. Yeah, we want to leave that in there, and grant the rights and licenses as specified above. The guest further represents and warrants that their performance will not infringe on any copyright, trademark, or other intellectual property rights held by a third party, does not contain any defamatory, libelous, or otherwise unlawful material, and that they've obtained all necessary consents and permissions for any third parties to appear in or are referenced in their performance. I don't think we need that. That's a little extra. Again, you could include it if you want to, but for me, it just feels like a little extra. Additionally, guest represents warrants performance as original work. Doesn't they already say that? That's not necessary. And then again, they're trying to throw in. Okay, they're making this also. They're mixing stuff here, so they're turning it into a indemnification clause now. So what are they doing here? They're representing and warranting. All right, so let's just delete that. And I talked about indemnification down here as an optional one. Originality was right there, and I think we got that up there. Warrants to production company that possess full right and power into this agreement and grant the rights and licenses specified above. That their performance is original and will not infringe upon any copyrights, blah, 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 held by a third party. I think we need an and there. We can do that. Okay, so this is the danger of using a tool like Gemini. It seems to be going off the rails a little bit and kind of, so these are two separate concepts within a contract. Representations and warranties section. Representations is one thing, warranties is another, and conditions is a whole other thing too. But we have a rep and warranty section, and then down here they continued talking about reps and warranties. Then they started mixing in this other concept that I mentioned earlier, this indemnification and hold harmless. And so I'm going to delete all that because it's not really necessary. I don't like to include that in a podcast release agreement. That's my personal preference. I don't think I would want to sign that as an individual. Come after me for breach of contract. That's kind of what I would say, and I think that's what most people would agree to. Again, you're trying to make this as low friction as possible. So anyways, yeah, a little bit extra stuff there from Gemini that we don't need. Okay, so going back here. Indemnify, compensate for the harm, podcaster for any claims, rights for their contributions. Podcaster can agree to indemnify the guest for certain claims arising from the podcaster's use of the content. I don't think so as a podcaster, but that's just me. Again, you might have a guest that requires that. Let's say you're deciding to do a bad actor and you decide to make a terrible edit of the person and put it out there. That would be one example of when you could do that. But anyways, as a podcaster, you should not be doing that. Otherwise, you're not going to have any other guest on your show. All right, so termination This is something you don't want them to be able to do if you're a podcaster. If you're the production company, you don't want them to be able to terminate the agreement and cancel, take back the rights and prevent you from further distribution. So really that's not something you want to include. So anyways, so confidentiality, consider a confidentiality clause if the podcast discusses sensitive or proprietary information. This is just comical because if you think about a podcast, it's going to be publicly released. I mean, right? Like, why on earth would you have a confidentiality clause? Maybe if you wanted it to be like, if again, going back to the thing, if you're paying a guest for, like, let's just say somebody's coming out with a new book, a tell-all book, and they're going to be on your podcast, you're paying them for that exclusive to be able to promote your podcast, or maybe vice versa. Maybe it's just like a mutual deal there. Their publisher has reached out to you and has pulled in this chunk of information that your podcast is going to be exclusive to release. Maybe you would include a confidentiality clause like this that says, like, there's a date by which you cannot release it. It cannot be released until this date when the publication of the book happens, or during the press window leading up to it, pre-release window, whatever. Maybe you would have confidentiality, but really that would just be a restriction on when it can be published. Okay, yeah, that's kind of comical. It would even mention that. Yeah, you can do governing law and jurisdiction if you want to, and then dispute resolution if you want to. Not necessary, in my opinion, for a agreement. Yeah, maybe, I think no matter what, you're going to have people in multiple states. So additional clauses, moral clauses, yeah, that could be included if you wanted to. It says here, allows determination if a party engages in conduct that damages the reputation of the podcast. Really, that should be of the guest. Ideally, you're not going to be doing damage to the podcast because you'll be able to edit it as a production company before it goes out. Addresses how the parties can use each other's names and likenesses for promotional purposes. Again, that's covered above with the name, image, and likeness. But anyways, yes, always consult with an attorney. Please consult with your own attorney. But anyways, okay. So we've gotten, I think, from what Gemini, just one prompt. I could probably continue prompting that and do all that. But oh yeah, I don't need to say consideration statement. That can be deleted. All right, so I probably could prompt out the rest of this to get something drafted here. That would make it actually pretty easy. Let's try elaborate. Oh man, it's starting to mess up with me. All right, so let's just, oops. A clause granting consent to recording and distribution of a podcast episode. Clause for probably draft a clause for a podcast guest granting consent to recording and distribution of a podcast episode. Let's see if this works. Okay. Non-exclusive, worldwide, perpetual, irrevocable, royalty-free right and license to record, edit, reproduce, distribute. That's pretty good. Perform the performance recording in any media, whether now... Hey, got it in there. Okay, maybe it's better to do it. Maybe it's picking up on what I wrote too, but this is much better. May use a performance recording for any purpose, promoting a contest, generate revenues, creating derivative works. You definitely want that in there for promotional purposes. Waives any and all claims and causes of action. Okay, again, this is kind of jumping now into a waiver of all that kind of stuff, which doesn't hurt. Let's just go ahead and work with this. One. All right. All right, so non-exclusive right to edit, reproduce, distribute, and publicly perform the performance. We got that in there, and I got that whole sentence in there. approval rights are optional. Put that in a comment to address later if we want to. Grant of rights. So yeah, we want to now cover, right of publicity. Let's just see what it does. Draft a clause granting the production company right to use the name, image, likeness, and voice of the podcast guest. Let's see if it does it. And it did it. Okay, in addition to the grants, rights granted to Section 1, they grant the blah, blah, blah. Okay, so they got name, image, likeness, and voice in connection with the production, distribution, and promotion of the podcast. Includes the right to use the guest's name, image, likeness, and voice in any media, whether now known or later invented, including an elevated podcast, videos, articles, social media post. Cool. Okay, it's kind of repetitive in that sense. So I feel like we could probably combine these in some way. So that would be a kind of a next step. I'm not going to be able to do that tonight, but that would probably just be like a next step to do. Again, that's kind of repetitive. I feel like we could probably pull this down here. So this is a kind of a waiver of damages and claims. And so we could pull that down here into more of the boilerplate stuff at the end of the contract. They waive any and all claims and causes of action against the production company and its affiliates, successors, and assigns. Successors, licensees, and assigns for any damages, losses, or expenses arising from or related to the recording, editing, reproduction, distribution, or public performance of the performance recording. Yeah, so some of the things that we could do to clean this up a little bit are kind of define the performance itself, the recording, all that kind of stuff, have some defined terms thrown in here to clean all this up. But I think it's gotten us pretty far with quite a lot already laid out. So probably going to stop here. Bold that, and that got us 3 sections. And then you got your boilerplate stuff that you could continue adding down here. I remember at the beginning I talked about maybe even including yeah, I think that's just the signature block. Draft a sentence before a signature block. Let's see what it comes up with. I'm just so curious about how well this can continue to be. Hey, there you go. It's very short and sweet. Please review and sign below to, and you don't review. Please sign below to indicate your agreement to the terms of this contract. We'll start there. Please sign below to indicate your acceptance and agreement to the terms above. All right. I'll have to say written name. I don't know why I put that in there earlier, but anyways, I would say that probably gets us pretty close to what we would need for a very baseline, very simplistic type of podcast guest release. I'll go ahead and rename it. There you go. Podcast guest release. I think one other thing we could probably do is ask here, how can this be improved? I've not had success with it doing this recently, and I'm wondering if it's like going to pick up on the fact that it's maybe a legal document, and it will probably decline to do anything. Oh, well, there we go. it actually is doing it. A termination clause. Again, it's maybe because we're calling it an agreement, we can just call it a release form, something like that. Specify the duration of the agreement. We kind of already do that by saying it's a perpetual irrevocable right and license. So that's covered there. Again, confidentiality clause. No, Google. I don't want to include that. Address the issue of IP ownership. That I think we cover up here because they give a right in their performance. In public performance. So I think we're pretty much covered there. Plain language. I think we have used pretty fairly plain language so far. And yes, of course, as I said at the beginning, and I will say it again now, thank you for reminding us, Google, please. This is not legal advice. This is legal education. It's for entertainment purposes only. Work with an attorney, a licensed attorney that is specific to you and knows your specific needs and all of that. So anyway, so yeah, I think it says plain language, whatever, IP, whatever, confidentiality, whatever. I think we got most of it covered. And I think maybe what would help is to call this a release form instead of an agreement. It doesn't really matter. Like I said, it's a contract. At the end of the day, this is a contract. You can kind of play around with it. This is the, again, this is the title. You can title it whatever you want. It just ideally be descriptive of what is actually being signed. And then these are all kind of just your design choice, your choice here of whether you include the podcast name, your production company, or your individual name if you have no production company. That would be like if you're a sole proprietor type setup where you're using your own social security number, your own name to operate your business. You don't even have a business entity set up. Individual name. Whoop. The recording date, ideally you would know that in advance before someone agrees to the form. And then episode, again, as I talked about earlier, it's difficult to know this. It's difficult to know your episode title name unless, again, you're planning your seasons. You have a podcast production that's planning seasons in advance and doing that kind of fun stuff. But okay. And then you have your section for your podcast guest. First and last name, business or their business name. Same thing up here. It can be an individual or it can be their corporate entity, depending on the level of sophistication they have in operating their business. And then their email address. That would be the bare minimum. You have other optional contact information, mailing address, phone numbers, etc. And then you have a statement of consideration, which is required for any contract. And then we kind of went through and had Google Gemini help us draft the consent to recording and the distribution of the podcast and the materials. And then you have a grant of rights, name, image, and likeness, and then representation. I'd probably go back and just clean this up again because, again, reviewing this live is probably not the best thing to do. I'd stop for a minute and go back through and review this with more of a fine-tooth comb. Reps and warranties section, and then also waiver. So you probably include that there. Waiver of damages as well. And then asking, it says, please sign below to indicate your acceptance of the agreement to the terms. So I think that pretty much covers a lot of what you would want to see in a podcast agreement. I will say the other element here that is worth kind of, if you want to future proof, this is not, as far as I know yet, a requirement. But if you wanted to include some type of statement of the use of AI tools, so if you want consent up here, consent to recording and distribution, I'm just going to do this really quickly with Google here and say draft a clause where the for the guest to consent to the use of AI tools in the production of the podcast. And let's see if it can kind of get at where I'm going with this too. Yep, there you go. Perfect. That's exactly what I was wanting. So I would think that it's important to go ahead and include this. Who knows what future regulation will be out there, but especially in the generative AI space, the AI space. But I don't think it hurts if you, since most creators are now implementing AI tools in their workflows, include an AI tools consent clause. As Google's come up with it. I just want to see what it does. Tell it to elaborate. Let's have it hallucinate a little bit more and generate something else here. Just kind of see what else it can come up with. But oh geez, okay, I don't want a novel, and it's giving me a novel. Shoot, this is like way more than I wanted. Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it's very nice of them to say to ensure transparency, it'll mandate the podcast producer inform the guest about the specific AI tools that are being used. But anyways, okay. I think I can go back and yeah, there's this original one that I was using. Okay, think this is short and sweet. I don't even think it needs to be its own section. We can just have it here. So yeah, it says the guest consents. Don't need the word hereby. The guest consents to the use of artificial intelligence tools. I would even clarify, including generative AI, in the production of the podcast, in the production, marketing, and promotion. Because if you think about it, you're going to be analyzing their voice. You're going to be sending their voice through tools. In Tennessee, where I'm based, I just passed this explicit consent requirement to utilize the voice for synthetic voice creation. But even then, if you're sending someone's voice through, which it's impossible to do that now, not to do that now, you're sending their voice through a system that analyzes it and creates a transcript and creates show notes and all that kind of fun stuff. If you're using it for captions, even for closed captions, I don't think it hurts to go ahead and start thinking about this and future-proofing your contracts in this way. So yeah, you could even just say it in that way. They consent to the use of those tools. They understand and agree that AI tools may be used to edit, enhance, or otherwise modify the performance recording. And then the guest further understands that it does not alter the terms of this agreement. Well, that's not necessary. All right, so I think those two sentences are enough. Maybe putting them... I'd have to review this a little bit more, but I think maybe 1 and 2 could be combined in some way. But this, I would want to make sure this isn't viewed as just not like it kind of overlaps with NIL down here, and I want to make sure that it's not construed as not covering the right to their name, image, and likeness as well. So either way, grant of rights, consent to recording, distribution. Kind of feel like it goes down here. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where it should go. Well, no, I go back and forth. I don't care. It doesn't really matter. I think it's still in the contract regardless. Consent to use of performance recording. And that would include the name, image, and or voice of guest. There you go. I think that would capture it too. Because really I want to make sure that if you're using Gen AI or some type of AI tool in connection with the name, image, or voice of guest, and really it's probably not even the name, it's more so the image and or voice of guest. That would probably cover you. That's what I think would cover most of that in this contract. Okay, I think that was the only other thing that I was really kind of wanting to highlight here in connection with this type of podcast agreement. But I mean, push back. I'd love to hear from you if you think that that type of clause on the Gen AI side isn't required. I'm more than happy to hear back from you. But anyways, I think that gets us to most of where we need to be. Again, drafting some other stuff. I'll put this out and make it more available. But I've been doing this. How long have I been live? Oh, there it is. Almost an hour and a half. I think that's long enough. I think it's really only been like an hour though, because the first like 20 minutes was spent. I think I was on mute at first, and then I couldn't get the screen share to go. So anyways, for those of you that are still watching, a couple of you are still watching, or if you're watching this later on demand, thanks for watching and tuning in. I'm going to do the usual, subscribe, like this video. I plan to do this more, even invite my friends like Brian to come and maybe join their channel too, because I know they're up to fun stuff too. But anyways, thanks for watching. I'm going to switch over to ending. Bye.